Your life exists largely in 2-year blocks. You're going to train for 18 months and you're going to deploy for 6. And for 2 weeks, you'll go dive. But right after that, maybe you'll go to the desert for a month and you're going to work only on land warfare tactics. But then after that, you're going to go out to the drop zone and you're going to skydive for 2 weeks. And then after that, you're going to go up to Alaska and you're going to work on cold weather. And each and every one of those chunks of time, you are starting from zero, the crawl, walk, run philosophy, and trying to get to run as fast as possible. What you need to do to be able to learn is get out of your own way, put aside your bias, and just do what you're told. When the instructors tell me that this is how you take a Kimura grip, that's how I take a Kimura grip. When they say this is how you hold mount, this is where your leg position should be, that's where your arm position should be, that's all I do. I don't try to put Andy's flair into jujitsu, just like I didn't try to make Andy's land warfare tactics when I was in the SEAL community. I understood the tactic and I did the tactic. I would go in and the guy would say, hold your gun like this, and I would hold it exactly like they said. Execute the drill like this, and I would execute it exactly like they said. And the best thing that you can do when it comes to learning is just get out of your own way and do exactly what you're told.
The world is changing. Inspiration is everywhere. It has never been so easy to connect, share, and bring people together. We're learning from others and finding the best in ourselves. Challenging our beliefs. Sharing our vulnerability. Overcoming our fears. Transforming ourselves so we can transform the world. How far can we go?
This is London Real. I am Brian Rose. My guest today is... This is London Real. I am Brian Rose. My guest today is Andy Stumpf, the American Navy SEAL, broadcaster, and base jumper. You enlisted in the Navy at age 17 and later joined SEAL Team 6, the most elite counterterrorism unit in the military. Over your 17-year SEAL career, you served in Iraq and Afghanistan, completed 10 deployments, and executed hundreds of combat operations. For your service, you were awarded 5 Bronze Star medals, the Purple Heart, the Joint Service Commendation Medal, 2 Combat Action Ribbons, and the Presidential Unit Citation. You are a skydiver and base jumper, and in 2015, you set 2 world records, jumping from 36,500 feet and flying over 18 miles in a wingsuit in order to raise $1 million for the Navy SEAL Foundation. Andy, welcome to London Real.
That was pretty good. Thanks for having me.
Look, it's great to have you, Andy. I'm so glad we could do this. I've been kind of just paying attention to you for some time now, and there's a lot of fascinating things you do. As far as where to start, I mean, so many places to start, but you strike me as a different kind of Navy SEAL, and maybe you can tell me if I'm off here. You know, because I've heard you at times say, it's almost like you say, you know, look, Navy SEALs aren't superheroes. I've just been trained to do this job really well, and we do it really well. Whereas a lot of other SEALs, and I've had a few on, I don't know, I always feel like there is this superhero era about it. And you seem to kind of cut through and just say, hey, I can talk about my things, and we're highly trained, but I'm also kind of a normal guy. I don't know, do I get that vibe from you different, or is that you and your personality?
You know, I get asked all the time about the SEAL community, and I am always asked about my career. And my take on speaking about my own career, I feel that truly you should be judged by your peers. And I actually shouldn't be able to give you a grade on, you know, if I were to give you an academic grade on my career from A to F, I would give myself a C or a C minus. And now that's not to say that I wasn't surrounded by people who did seem like superheroes, because I personally felt that way. I was surrounded by people who were more physically capable than me. They were much more intelligent and articulate than me. They were better at shooting, at decision-making, at mission planning, at skydiving, fill in the blank. So there are people out there on both ends of the spectrum. You know, the SEAL community is a bell curve. There is a bottom 10% and there's a top 10%, and then 80% or so in the middle. And perhaps you have sat down with more people who are at the top end of the bell curve. When you're sitting down and talking with me, we're going towards the other end of the bell curve. I'm the guy who tried to have a career as a gray man, somebody who didn't arrive on any radar screen of any kind. I tried to do my job. I tried to do my job well. I tried to enable mission success and not hold the people back who were around me, but I didn't really feel capable of doing much more than that. So there certainly are what I would consider to be some superheroes in that community. I just don't feel like I am one myself.
It's interesting. Whenever I talk to someone in that community, and I have a lot of respect for everyone there, I've learned so many lessons from, Jocko's extreme ownership really blew me away. And, speaking to guys like Goggins and Tim Kennedy, and I always get serious lessons from them, like really serious. But I also feel like since I never served, they'll never actually be able to talk to me in a way, if that makes sense. I always feel like they'd be like, well, you might have done some great things, Brian, and you might win an Olympic gold medal, and you might give a TED talk, and you might, cure cancer, but you've never done what we've done. And I mean, maybe that's true though. Maybe I will never have an experience like that, but I always feel like I'll never be able to know. Is that me just being weirdly paranoid, or is it because going through those difficult things really is a different thing in life?
I think it's a combination of a few things. I think it's a lot of people put military service on a pedestal. And personally, I don't think that it should be put there. It's a unique occupation with unique requirements, but it doesn't make the individual who serves unique in any way, shape, or form. You might have some experiences if you operate in a combat environment, and you have to think about the military and the U.S. military as a whole. If you judge or think about the U.S. military from what you see in books, TVs, or movies, it is my opinion that you are going to have a very skewed perspective of what the occupations actually are. About 15% of the U.S. military actually has a job occupation that by definition is supposed to engage in combat. So we're already stripping 85% of the people who are in the U.S. military from some of those experiences that you were talking about, even though they serve the country and honorably as well. And before I say anything else, what I was able to do in the military was because of those other 85%. It's one big wheel and it takes all of the cogs. And one thing that I think is unfortunate is that most of the attention is spent on occupations like mine, and very little is spent on the occupations that enabled me to do what I was able to do. I don't know how to fly a helicopter or maintenance one or service the weapons to the degrees that the armorers did. And I don't know where the bullets came from or the aircraft lift and the intelligence and the weather specialists and all of these things that had to come together for me to be able to actually go on target. So 85% of the military is not designed to touch combat in any way, shape, or form. And then inside of that 15%, I would say maybe 5% of that 15% actually gets to see combat. And I'm glad that you don't have those experiences. It was an incredibly complex, rewarding, challenging, painful environment at times. But any lesson learned in that environment, I feel like it's more concrete for me because I was in that environment and operating in that environment. But the lessons can be taken from that, and they can be overlaid, in my opinion at least, anywhere in society and in almost any job occupation. There's, of course, some job-specific things that we learned from engaging in combat that are not going to have much to do with banking or real estate or healthcare. And that's okay. Strip those small percentages away. But everything else, when it comes to, you mentioned Jocko about extreme ownership. You can apply those concepts. I don't care who you are and what you do. You can apply that to just being a stay-at-home mom or a stay-at-home dad, and those concepts will still apply. Tim Kennedy, the Army Special Forces background, or Rangers, or MARSOC, or SEALs. The lessons are very similar in all of those communities because the job is actually very similar. I think those communities are defined by their similarities and not by their differences. But all of those lessons learned, explained appropriately and looked at through the correct context, can have a positive impact on your life, regardless of whether or not you will ever experience them yourself or your job title that you might have.
And you remember those lessons because a lot of times they were taught to you in very strenuous, emotionally challenging situations, whether that's in BUD/S or whether that's in Iraq or Afghanistan.
Hopefully they're taught to you in a training environment and then they're reinforced in a combat environment. It is very challenging to learn new lessons in combat because the stakes are so dire.
Can you remember your best day on the job and your worst day on the job? And I'm sure those best and worst have strange definitions too, but
Yeah, worst day on the job for me, one of 2 days. The first one be the day that I got shot overseas because my operational career came to a screeching halt at that point, and I was unsure whether or not I was going to be able to continue in that career path. It happened 2005, so it happened 9 years into my military service, and I ended up doing 17, so I was able to continue. Second most difficult day for me in my career was the day that I drove off base for the last time and had a crashing realization that I had spent my adult life doing the one thing that I knew I wanted to do and had not spent the requisite amount of time thinking about what I wanted to do after. So, and then as far as my best day in the SEAL community was the day that my first son was born. It trumped anything that I've ever done in uniform, and it has more meaning and impact to me than anything that I will ever be rewarded for that I did when my time in uniform or remembered for that matter.
why is that?
Because everybody in the military, and again, this is my opinion, and anytime I speak about the military, I try to be very clear with this. I can only speak from my experiences and from my opinion. I don't speak for the military or anybody else. So my time in uniform was rented. I don't care who you are and how great you serve. There is a point in time in your life where you're going to hang, metaphorically and figuratively, hang up your uniform in a closet, and you're not going to get to wear it anymore. And you'll have some impact during that time that you served, but it's not going to be very long lasting. And looking back at both my time in Iraq and Afghanistan, it made a difference, but it made a difference in that moment, and it made a difference in that specific geography, and maybe a little bit if you start to think about a small action and the impact that it had and how it could have a greater impact, the ripple effect, perhaps. But I think the things that we were doing at a tactical level, more than anything, we're having a tactical difference in that moment. Whereas my role as a father for my 3 kids is my ability to have a generational shift or change in the world. They can have a greater impact on everybody that they touch, a magnitude of order greater than anything that I did in either Iraq or Afghanistan while wearing a uniform in service to the country.
Interesting. But yet you're probably one of the few SEALs that would say what you just said.
I don't know. I don't remember having very deep conversations with the guys. I mean, I'm not trying to devalue the impact of what we had, but my last combat deployment was in 2010, and I was a father before that, and I'll be a father till the day that I die. To me, I have much more ability to impact the world through my kids than I do my time in uniform.
Right. And can you talk about the day you got shot and what happened, what you learned, and how you had to really fight pretty hard to even come back?
Yeah, I mean, it's far less of a Hollywood tale than most people might think. We were working for weeks before that evening, and everything had pretty much gone as planned before then. There was nothing particularly amazing about the target that we were going on or the people that we were looking for. And nothing happened that night leading up to it that seemed incredibly abnormal. So I equate it to going to places like Las Vegas, where you watch somebody playing craps and they're rolling the right number after the right number after the right number. All the casino really needs to do is keep you in that building for long enough, and at some point you're going to throw a 7 and you're going to crap out. Statistically, in a combat occupation where you're facing up against other human beings that have a vote and they can shoot back at you, I think at some point, you're going to reach a statistical point where you're on the wrong side of the dice. And I thought a lot about, in the days after I got shot, whether or not I had done something wrong, or if I had been in a position where I shouldn't have been, or maybe I made too much noise. And the reality is, I didn't. I was using cover and concealment. I happened to turn my head. I was basically approaching a door, and we were going to set a breaching charge on a door. And I was, as somebody is placing explosives on a door, you want to have somebody up there with them with a gun, because their hands are task occupied with their explosive charge. But there was a door behind me, or a window behind me, and before I was going to turn my back to it, I wanted to look in it. And as I shifted my head, somebody shot at me from a window near the door. And it came down to, they saw me before I saw them. They were able to shoot before I was able to shoot back. And it literally and figuratively slammed me on my back. I was medevaced out of the country within 48 hours. I was starting my journey back to the United States. Took a little bit longer than that to get back to the United States. But that wheel of the military, it kept on spinning. I didn't see any of the guys that I was working with in the hospital in Iraq. I got medevaced with another guy that was on target with me. He went a different direction because he was in the Army. I was in the Navy, so we went back to different duty stations. And I got home and I was left to my own devices to try to figure out my own rehab and recovery. Because at that time in 2005, in my opinion, the U.S. military was not as prepared as they could have been for the number of casualties and injuries that they would sustain later on. And I don't fault them for that. I just don't think we knew what we were getting into. So I had a lot of time on my own with a lot of pill bottles, and I was in a lot of neuropathic pain. So I went down a rabbit hole a little bit. I don't know if I would call it addiction, but I certainly would call it abuse of the medications that they were giving me. And I think a lot of it was driven because I didn't have a sense of purpose anymore. I didn't know if I was going to be able to operate at the level that I was operating at before. I didn't know if I was even going to be able to stay at the command that I was at before. And the people that I was with, they were still overseas operating at an incredibly high level, which is where I wanted to be. So it was very physically challenging from the pain perspective, but probably even more so emotionally and mentally challenging, and having to deal with all that. And it took me about a year to get my head turned on correctly, reoriented in the direction that I wanted to go. And that actually started for me physically. I just forced myself to go into the gym and start working out. And by physically exhausting myself, I was able to get myself to mentally and emotionally just relax a little bit. And I started sleeping better. And it's kind of a narrative that has stuck with me for the rest of my life. Like, I have to be physical in what I'm doing for an enhanced mental and emotional state. The two are just intrinsically tied for me. But it was a very long path back. It took me about a year and a half to get back on full active duty. And then I went to a training command on the West Coast. I left the command that I was at when I got shot, went to a training command on the West Coast, and then did one more deployment in 2010. So I went from working at a really high level to being at the basement to getting myself back up to a deployable status. Did one more. I think a lot of that was for me to prove to myself that I was going to be able to do it again. And then the time came shortly after that my body just really wasn't physically able to do the job anymore.
Wow. And what were the extent of your injuries? Like, where did you get hit and how did you have to rehab yourself?
So the rehab, I mean, there's nothing much that could be done because the injury that I sustained was largely neuropathic. So I got shot in the side of the hip from about 15 feet away from an AK-47. And the round either directly interacted with my sciatic nerve, or the window had some metal rebar in it, and the round probably nicked one of the pieces of rebar because as it was spinning on its way towards me, it was coming apart a little bit. So it wasn't one just bullet hole. It kind of spackled the side of my leg. So the round either clipped or cut my sciatic nerve, or if you've ever watched ballistic gel, as a bullet comes through it, it makes a little bit of a wave as it distorts the ballistic gel. That also could have interacted with my sciatic nerve, but it basically short-circuited my left leg from the point of impact all the way down to the terminating point in my ankle. So I was a hemiplegic for almost a year, which is basically paralysis of one side of my body. And I was distracted during the daytime because I was focusing on whatever was going on in my day. But I would lay down in bed at night and try to sleep, and I felt like my leg was just on fire. The best description is dipping my entire leg in gasoline and then just laying in bed and lighting that on fire. And it was inescapable, which of course took me to, the pill bottles and washing it down with booze, which is not actually resting. That's just passing out. So that didn't help. But there really was no rehab. I was told by far more doctors with far more education than me. I would go and I would ask them, what can I expect? And my answer would be shoulder shrug. I don't know, and I would look at them and say, I didn't go to medical school and I don't know either. So could potentially I get a different answer from you than that? And they would say, 1 millimeter a day and maybe an inch a month of regrowth. And hopefully at some point the nerve will start to regenerate itself, but it would need to go from the point of impact all the way down to my ankle, which was a few feet away. And it never really did. It stopped about 2 to 3 inches below the kneecap. So I still have some really bad residual nerve damage in my left leg. Pretty common occurrence for me is to roll my ankle because I have a really hard time with stabilization and muscle control. So the rehab is, I don't know when it stopped becoming rehab and it just started becoming, this is the way that I live my life now. But most people, it's so funny, the human body and its ability to compensate. Most people who don't know that I was shot would never know because my walking gait is normal. and I just kind of know how to guard against physical activities that stress my ankle. And it's not, obviously it's not something I tell people. Like I meet them for the first time, be like, hey, let's have a cup of coffee. By the way, I got shot. So it's not, they might find out a year later, and the most common response is they're shocked that I actually sustained that injury, because I'm able to live a very fulfilling life and be as active as I want to be.
And you redeployed even with that injury.
I did, but it got a little bit touchy towards the end of that. You know, like I said, my ankle rolling and the stability in my ankle is difficult enough for me as it is with just my body weight. And you start adding 60, 70, 80, 90, 100 pounds of additional body weight, you know, that lever that's getting torqued on gets worse and worse and worse. So that deployment, I was able to nurse my way through that, even though there was some pretty catastrophic rolls of my ankle. But I don't think I would have been able to continue on past that. What would have happened is I would have been a physical liability to everybody else that was around me, and I wasn't willing to put that risk on top of them.
Wow. And on top of that, you're dealing with this strange situation, like you said, where you've got nobody from your unit, you're home, you know, dealing with your injuries, nobody to talk to, probably no therapy, whether it would have helped or not. I mean, that's a very strange situation to be. And also back at home in America, you know, all of a sudden, it just, I mean, that must be a very strange place to be.
It's hard to describe. You know, you're in a different place. You go from being on a very kinetic target to being back in your house within 4 to 5 days. Young child at home at the time. My wife at the time was pregnant with our second child. It's a jolt to the system, but it's also a jolt to the system that I was a little bit used to at that time, that integration, because it wasn't my first combat deployment. It was the first time I had come home in that capacity, but it's challenging. It takes you time to unwind from the mindset you have overseas and to unravel. Well, maybe unravel is perhaps a bad term. To assimilate back into the pace of life at home, which is substantially slower, and the stakes are much, much lower. And it takes time to adjust between those two environments.
You know, that term PTSD is thrown around a lot, and I think it has a lot of different meanings. But like one that seems to be very applicable is when you come back, like you said, to that low stakes environment, your brain is still triggered for a high stakes environment. And so everything looks like a potential threat, and it's very hard to dial that down. Also, you're also missing a lot of other things, the camaraderie, the mission, the purpose. I mean, is that what a lot of PTSD is based on, or is there really a whole rainbow of that?
PTSD is a tough one. To me, I think the D should be stripped from that. I don't think it's a disorder. I think if you come back the same person that you left, then perhaps you might actually have a disorder. You know, if the body gets sick, usually the temperature will elevate and you'll have a fever. If you get sick and you don't have a fever, that's actually the disorder. So having something happen to your body and having your body have a reaction to it is a very natural thing. And post-trauma in general affects people very differently, even inside of the SEAL community. There's people that are bothered by very little, and then there are people who are bothered very much by very little. And it's tough to judge, and I don't think you should judge anybody in comparison to anybody else. It's an individual journey. And having said that, though, it's okay. You know, you come back, and it's not like you're looking for a threat around every corner. I think that is a stereotype, again, that largely comes from books, TVs, and movies. You know, you're just used to making different decisions. You're used to making decisions that are much more black and white. Do I take action or do I not take action? Do I pay attention to this? Do I not pay attention to this? And like any situation that you work in, if you worked on Wall Street and then you wanted to become a real estate agent, it's going to take you time to unravel from one and to integrate into the other. Combat and coming home, it's exactly the same thing. And again, there's no timeline that works for everybody. Some people can do it very quickly, and some people will struggle to do it for the rest of their life. And that's okay. And I think that should be expected. You know, I look at war now from a different perspective than I did when I was in. I thought even then that it should have been a measure of last resort. You should exhaust any and all options before committing people to an environment where lives can be taken, both American lives and the lives of people in the country that we're going to fight in. Because if you do so, if you touch war, war will touch you back. And that's the bottom line. And if you're going to commit your people to an environment where they are going to touch war, you have to be able to accept the long-term consequences of the impact it will have on their life when they come home.
Yeah, Jocko always says that you have to have the will to kill and the will to die if you want to go there. And they're very big, those are big things that you have to really get your head around. And I don't think that's always understood. And now we see these are long-term commitments as well.
You have to have those two things, right? The will to kill and the will to die. But you also have to have the will to take care of the people who are willing to volunteer to go do those things. We are living in a time where there is no draft, and that's a very fortunate thing. So we have an all-volunteer force. About 0.5% of the U.S. population is serving in the United States military. Like I said, 85% of them are not going to touch combat directly. Inside of that 15%, a very small fraction is actually going to, and it will touch them for the rest of their lives. So not only do you have to have the willpower to kill or be killed, but the country as a whole has to be committed to what those actions have, what they have globally, and then at an individual level. Yeah, it's much more difficult than just the desire to kill or the willingness to kill or the willingness to give your own life.
Yeah, and I feel like Vietnam kind of gave us that amplified version maybe for the first time, where people got to see like that, the big effect, the social unrest, and it just ripped the country apart and ripped other countries apart. I don't know, that's the one that just comes to mind right away. Maybe it also wasn't clouded or highlighted by a victory in Europe or something as well, where it was like, wow, look what we just did. We got into a really messy thing. And yeah,
and the current wars that we're fighting as well, there's not going to be a VE day. There's no victory day where we're going to sit down. I don't know how you sit down with an ideology that is a multi-headed hydra across the globe and sign an agreement saying that we're going to stop fighting. It's just not going to happen. So I think we're engaged in essentially what are forever wars. At what scale that's going to be is the unknown, but I don't know how it ever completely stops.
Yeah. I appreciate that observation. Tell me about the opiates. I actually had a nice struggle with opiates and an overdose in 2001 that I just started talking about a couple of years ago. And they're a funny drug, because you don't know what's happening to you when you go down that road, and it's very hard to make clear decisions. That's what I found, and I don't know what you found, but it's when I tell people I got off this stuff, it's quite an unlikely scenario to get off them, and I'm just wondering how that happened to you, and even advice you give to other people.
So, to a degree, I feel like I got lucky because I have a genetic blood abnormality that processes those type of narcotics slightly differently. So when they gave me morphine in the hospital when I got shot, I had never had morphine before. And I talk about stereotypes from movies. I thought they were going to stick a syringe in my leg and I was going to be sitting there drooling on myself. And the first time they gave me a bolus of morphine, I remember kind of just sitting there like, hey, when does the party start? Because my leg hurts still. And then they gave me more, and then they gave me more, and then they gave me more, and then they pulled out a spreadsheet that had weight and the amount of morphine that I had. And if they exceeded that point, basically my heart was going to stop. I was going to have a central nervous system suppression, but it really wasn't having an incredible effect on my body. And then talking with my sister, she was the first one who determined that we had an abnormality when it came to processing those type of drugs. And others, actually. They were trying to put her out when they were taking her wisdom teeth, and they gave her the classic count backwards from 100. Most people make it to 97, and then they pass out. And my sister's sitting there 15, 14, 13. She's making it all the way. And they get to a point where they can't even put her out. So we have an abnormality that processes those types of drugs differently. So for me, Percocet and Vicodin, it doesn't do very much for me. I didn't get a lot of pain relief from it. I think I was getting more of the pain relief from the alcohol. So I didn't get addicted to opiates per se. I got into a really bad habit of combining opiates and alcohol. And for me, it was more the alcohol that was providing the relief. I just happened to have readily accessible in front of me, as many Percocet as I wanted, as many Vicodin as I wanted, as many oxycodone as I wanted. And eventually I ended up throwing them away, and it had no impact on me. So I got very lucky in that respect. So I'm probably not the best to talk about that particular type of addiction.
Right. And then you decided to get in the gym and start sweating it out.
Yep.
It's funny. I've talked about Jocko and Tim Kennedy, and Jocko said get a mission. That's what he said. When you get back, get a new mission. That's his advice to people that struggle with going down destructive routes. And Kennedy said, train, eat good foods, stop drinking, and stop telling yourself you have a problem. That's Tim's advice that he gave me last week, I think. So I don't know. Those were their thoughts as far as to how to kind of move through a lot of that stuff.
I mean, I'd combine the two. Again, I'm not a fan of broad prescriptions, because the more broader your prescription, the more inaccurate it's going to be for a lot of people. You know, telling people to find a new purpose, yeah, that sounds great. That's a good soundbite, but that's not easy. You know, that takes a lot of soul searching. It takes a lot of looking inward and determining why you want to do the things that you want to do. What is it that intrinsically motivates you? You know, Tim's advice to train, yes, that's awesome. And like I said, for me, physical health and mental health they're tied. I have to have both. But if you can combine training with a new mission or a new purpose, it's going to help you in those days where you have less motivation. So I think you should combine the two. And just saying, hey, you know, stop telling yourself that you have a problem. I don't know if that's a complete solution either, because some people do have problems. I think the more valuable lesson that could be learned, or the more valuable conversation you could have with yourself, is, hey, you know what? I'm not doing well. I actually think I do have a problem. So instead of telling myself that I don't, what I'm going to do is dive headlong into finding some help and support. And I'm going to be vocal about this, and then try to find as many people as possible who are struggling with the same things and try to help them as well.
Right. Oh, that's super good advice. You have a term, I think I've heard you say, that is danger brings clarity. And I think you said that when people asked why you base jump and skydive, but I think you've talked about the times you had overseas where you noticed that danger did bring you some clarity, and it was something that I think you found somehow soothing as well. And maybe that's why you pursue some of these other aspects. Am I getting that right? Or is there a better way to explain that?
I'd say you're 95% there. And it's not something that's unique to the military. There have been books written about this. And the most common term that I've heard to describe that headspace is the flow state. And people find it all the time in high level sports, whether that be, I've heard it, ski jumping, for whatever reason, rings that I've heard it true to me. I've heard professional shooters talking about it. I've heard MMA fighters talking about it. I've heard people who publicly speak talk about it before they go on stage. It's more than, I don't know if it was caused by the danger, because I've been able to find it elsewhere. A good example would be jiu-jitsu, where there really is no danger. You know, you're simulating murder with a buddy and you've made an agreement you're not going to kill each other. So there's really not that high of stakes. You're not going to die. But you can find that state of hyper-focus, hyper-attention on just one thing. And I certainly found it overseas, though. You know, I would usually find it in a helicopter ride when we were starting to get closer to the objective. And it's just, I would describe it as my mind's ability to pare away the things that no longer mattered in the moment. So I'm not worried about an argument with my spouse, or whether or not there's enough money in the checking account, or the phone call we just had because the washer and dryer are no longer working because of whatever reason. They always seem to fail when you're on deployment, when you can do nothing about it. And then, you know, you get to the 1 minute out, and all you're thinking about is the next thing that you need to do, your actions, what you need to do next, the tactic, the technique, the procedure that you need to execute. And it's an amazing place to be. And I think it's actually a very mentally refreshing place to be, because speaking for myself, I am bombarded, and I suspect most people are every day, with just information, communication, social media, traditional media. And you're thinking about and you're worrying about so much stuff. And I don't think most people even realize they're being bombarded on a daily level. And to find a place where none of that registers, where you have this umbrella up and those raindrops are just bouncing off of it instead of getting in between your ears, is hugely beneficial. It resets for me a lot of my thought process. It resets for me a lot of my emotional process. And I think it's a very powerful place to be. It has impact. I'll go to in 2 hours from now, I'll be going and I'll be doing jiu-jitsu, and we do a class and then we roll for an hour afterwards. And that hour for me of just playing the game with another person and only thinking about that, because if you're trying to think 8 moves ahead, you're going to get choked out 2 moves from where you are. If you're thinking about whether or not you have enough money in your checking account to cover your mortgage, you're going to get choked out. I can tell you that right now, because that's happened to me more than once. But it's beautiful. That 1 hour sets me up for days or weeks that it's just so refreshing to find that place.
Yeah, I think we're all looking for that place, and some people can find it in cooking, slicing vegetables because they have to focus on something. But for me, two things I can think of that aren't necessarily a high danger factor is jiu-jitsu for sure. When I go in there, I know there's no way I'll be thinking of anything else when I'm on the mat. I'm rolling no gi with a black belt who's just trying to take me out. I just know it's happening. And then
go ahead and think about something else while you're rolling with the black belt. Let me know how that works out for you.
Yeah. I don't even think about other stuff at that point because it's just, yeah. And there's something beautiful about that for sure. Yeah. And that's probably why I keep going back. And then cold water as well. When I jump in and do like the Wim Hof stuff, or I jump into a really cold thing, sometimes I just know that's always going to do it. So I go there and I just know it's going to reset me in a great way because my body's so shocked that there's nothing else to think about at that point. So,
and I think that's the key. You identified two things for yourself. I've identified things for myself. And it's very easy to listen to other people talking about what works for them and to chase those things. And I'm not saying that's a bad start, but don't get frustrated if what works for me or for you doesn't work for somebody listening or watching this. Take the time. Maybe it is slicing vegetables for you. And if you can do that slicing vegetables, then slice vegetables. Figure out what it is that works for you and then dive headlong down that path.
Yeah, quiet the mind, right? No mind, I think the samurai used to call it, or something like that. Talk to me about, you said in the SEAL training, one of the greatest things they taught you was they taught you how to learn, or that you learned how to learn when you were there. Just wondering how they did that and how maybe other people could learn from those lessons.
Yeah, so you look at the story arc of a conventional SEAL team, and it's your life exists largely in 2-year blocks. You're going to train for 18 months and you're going to deploy for 6. That 18-month time period is probably broken up into 2 to 3 week individual blocks of training. And for 2 weeks, you'll go dive, scuba dive, or actually you're not going to do any scuba diving. You're going to be doing closed circuit diving, which just means no bubbles escape. It's a sneaky way to move around in the water. Because obviously if you're above the surface, you see bubbles, you're like, hey, what's causing those bubbles? But right after that, maybe you'll go to the desert for a month and you're going to work only on land warfare tactics. But then after that, you're going to go out to the drop zone and you're going to skydive for 2 weeks. And then after that, you're going to go up to Alaska and you're going to work on cold weather. And each and every one of those chunks of time, you are starting from zero, the crawl, walk, run philosophy, and trying to get to run as fast as possible. And you have various experience levels from people who've done this cycle 5, 6, 7, 8, 10 times to somebody who's on their first cycle. So we have to train to the lowest common denominator, but also in the back of our mind, think about the performance of the team. So it's new skill set after new skill set after new skill set ad nauseum throughout the course of a career. And you get really good at, to answer your question, do they teach a structured approach to learning? No, I don't remember any specific brief where they said to me, Andy, this is how you learn. So when I talk about this, it's me looking in the rearview mirror and understanding why we were able to learn these new skills. And the number one thing is they always laid out for us standards, and they always gave us a skeleton or a framework moving forward. So they took the time to teach. That's the first thing they did, is they laid out the objective, where the standards are along the way, and how we were going to get from where we are to that objective. And the biggest thing that I can recommend to people, and this again ties into jiu-jitsu, so you can let me know how your own experience goes. The biggest thing that I've noticed for people when they want to learn jiu-jitsu, and especially if they come from another martial arts background, is they have a lot of internal bias when they get there. They want to say things like, well, what about doing it like this? Right? An instructor will say, hey, when you're going to get a Kimura grip, this is how you do it, or side control, or mount top. This is where you need to be. And I'll see people in class raise their hand and say, well, I've seen it done on YouTube like this. And inside, I'm telling myself, well, what I want to say to them is, shut up. What you need to do to be able to learn is get out of your own way, put aside your bias, and just do what you're told. When the instructors tell me that this is how you take a Kimura grip, that's how I take a Kimura grip. When they say this is how you hold mount, this is where your leg position should be, that's where your arm position should be, that's all I do. I don't try to put Andy's flair into jiu-jitsu. Just like I didn't try to make Andy's land warfare tactics when I was in the SEAL community. I understood the tactic and I did the tactic and I trained to that standard. And when we would have new instructors come in, we got to go to the highest level of shooting instructors year after year after year. And they all teach differently. And I never once said to one of the instructors, well, this guy taught me this. because I'm not trying to challenge them. I would go in and the guy would say, hold your gun like this. And I would hold it exactly like they said. Execute the drill like this. And I would execute it exactly like they said. I have the rest of my life to worry about the bias or time off of the range, but I want to go to learn. And the best thing that you can do when it comes to learning is just get out of your own way and do exactly what you're told.
Wow, it's powerful advice. Yeah, that's really powerful advice. Although I could say the normal person would never do that, right? Because we just bring so much to the table.
But you know what, though? That's okay. You can learn. Watch people who are really good at learning new skills. I mean, of course, there are some anomalies when it comes to every species. And there are some human beings who are unbelievable, and it seems like everything comes natural to them. But they're the anomaly. So don't try to model yourself after the anomaly. Maybe try to model yourself after the norm. Most people, I mean, if you go to a jiu-jitsu class, you're going to see people that pick it up faster than others. Ask them, hey, what are you thinking in your head when you're learning a new technique? And I bet you what they're going to say is, I'm just doing exactly what the instructor says.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I follow John Danaher on Instagram, and I had him on the show, actually, and he's one of Renzo Gracie's black belts. And
I know who John Danaher is. He wears a rash guard everywhere.
Yeah, he wore a rash guard to my interview in New York as well.
Of course he did.
Well, he wasn't to a wedding, I heard as well. And I love you, John, by the way, if you're watching. But, John is always, he's teaching at the high level, and he's constantly microblogging about how people can learn and learn faster. And, was talking about knowledge and skills and tactics and strategy. And it's definitely interesting to learn from a guy who teaches learning more than anything. And it's fascinating to hear those thoughts. Well, I mean, you just talked about the day in the life of a SEAL where you're basically training at the highest levels. I mean, that sounds like a really cool thing to do, to be able to, what did the government spend training you? I mean, millions and millions of dollars to go to the it sounds like the coolest places with the coolest instructors. And I don't know, was it cool? And did you ever pinch yourself? Or did you ever look back and say, wow, I really was it's such a special experience to be training from the most elite people? Or did it come with so much difficulty and challenges as well that it was all hard to see it at the time?
The challenges were definitely drowned out by the experience. I mean, I knew where I was. I realized what was happening. I was in the military, but I got to interface with people who are not inside of the special operations community. I realized how incredibly unique it was, the job that we had. I mean, look at our job as a SEAL inside of the Navy. Most people in the Navy are on a boat of some kind, an aircraft carrier, destroyer, a submarine. Like, that's not my jam. And that's not what I signed up for. And I don't know an exact amount of how much it costs or how much money they invested into me. I've heard that it costs about $1 million just to get somebody through BUDS, which you're not even a SEAL at the end of that. It's the beginning of your career as opposed to the end. I mean, I've shot well over 1 million rounds of, variety of pistol and rifle cartridges. Just the sticker price on that alone is not cheap, let alone the mortars and rockets. And, the only thing I never got to shoot was a flamethrower, which I'm still pissed about to this day because it's the most amazing weapon ever. But it was incredibly special. It was amazing. I was surrounded by people that I loved being around. It was everything that I ever thought it could be when I was a young man coming into the community, and then so much more so. And it's definitely highlighted by some pain along the way, but those things are drowned out by the good experiences and the memories that I have.
Do you recommend that young men go into the SEALs? And just a little bit of context, I know a good friend who's a doctor, and they're both doctors, him and his wife, and I think their son is around the age, and he's looking into this, and he's very excited about it. But they also know that SEALs take a lot of damage physically, and I'm sure mentally as well. And I just wondered what you think about that.
I would say it depends. I think the biggest determining factor, and we have to go back to, because they have to make it through BUDS first, which is a crucible by any definition. The stats are the stats. It's going to have about a 75% attrition rate in summer months and 85 to 90% attrition rate in the winter months, year after year, decade after decade. It just is what it is. So, is a SEAL career damaging to your body? In some degrees it is, but you have to get into that community first. And I think the number one determining factor is why people want to be there in the first place. If they're driven to serve, if they feel like it's a purposeful driven career, your odds are okay, and I would recommend for people who have that desire and passion to serve outside of themselves, that's a good thing. If you're coming there for notoriety, because you want to write a book, because you want to get Instagram followers, you're going down the wrong path. And those things, those desires are going to fall along the wayside when you're more tired than you've ever been, colder than you've ever been, hungrier than you've ever been, and you're on day 3 of a 6-month training program.
Yeah, I've heard that as well. I think Jocko mentioned that you talk to the guys like the first day of buds and why are you here? Because I want to be the baddest ass in the world, or I'm here so my family's proud of me, or I'm here to serve. And he said that does play out kind of as the week goes on. How would you explain buds to some old lady who's never heard of it? And then how would you say buds was for you? How do you get through buds? And finally, is buds antiquated, or is it the exact thing that's necessary for SEAL membership?
So maybe I'll go in the reverse order. I don't think it's antiquated at all. It's the demands of buds are set by the demands of the battle space. And whether it be Vietnam or Afghanistan or Iraq or probably even World War I or World War II, the physical demands of combat are relatively the same. So I think it creates, or I should say, selects for individuals that are suited well from a mental or physical perspective, because it is testing both. And it oftentimes, you're really testing the mental side through physical ability or the physical side through mental toughness. It's very interesting. It's an indirect route at the actual selection. So I don't think it's antiquated at all. I think the performance of the community speaks to the fact, we're taking people from that crucible, from that selection process, putting them into the community, and the results from the community speak for themselves. And they have for, decades, since the 60s when the SEAL teams were first created, and even before then, the UDT. So I don't think it's antiquated. How to describe it, or how was it for me? It sucked. Bud sucks for everybody. The best advice that I got when I was going through buds was stop thinking about this from a perspective of a 6-month training program. Instead of saying, hey, I'm on day 2 and I have 178 days more to go, which is a recipe for absolute failure in that program, because you will become overwhelmed between where you are and where you want to be. That gap in between is all you'll be able to see. So the advice I was given is, don't even keep track of the days. Just try to make it to sunrise, or sunset every day. Your goal when the sun comes up is to see the sun go down. And if you want to quit, make that decision after the sun goes down. And I stopped keeping track of the days. And eventually 1 day becomes 2, and 2 becomes 3, and 5 becomes 20. And then you're at 180. And the next thing you know, you're standing on a graduation podium. And you can apply that in Hell Week as well. People think that, it's the same problem that students have. It starts on a Sunday and it ends on a Friday. And they can only think about how cold they can be, or how tired, or how hungry, or how exhausted they are. And it's Monday. How could I possibly survive until Friday? And the advice I give people, and the advice that was given to me, and it was powerful in training, was don't even worry about what day it is. Just try to make it to your next meal, because they have to feed you in that week every 6 hours. So you chunk it. You chunk it into something that is digestible. And if that doesn't work, chunk it deeper. Go every 3. If that doesn't work, chunk it deeper, and just make it through the evolution that you are currently participating in. And then don't worry about what's next. Worry about what's next when what's next comes. And it makes it very digestible. So it was difficult, but there's ways that you can mentally approach it that will set you up for success. And the best way that I would describe it to somebody who has no understanding of what it is that it's a selection course. It really is. It's a course that is designed around mental toughness and some physical requirements that you have to be able to have. And the truth is that any 1 day of buds is not that hard. Any person, I really do believe that just about anybody could make it through 1 day of buds. What makes buds hard is that there's 180 of those days that are stacked back to back to back to back. So I describe it as maybe a 220 grit sandpaper. And one day I have you come in the morning and I say, hey, take this piece of sandpaper and just go across your knuckles with it one time. People be like, okay, that's not really comfortable, but I'll do it. Now come back 179 days. Day 2, it's going to feel less good. Day 3, it's going to feel less good. And the number of people who'll be willing to do that 180 days in a row is going to be somewhere between 25% to 15% on graduation day.
And the Hell Week is the one we see on TV at the end, those 5 days of wet, cold, everything.
When I went through, that was the 5th week of the first phase of training. First phase is 10 weeks long, so it's right in the middle. And then you still have 2 additional phases. So it's actually very early on in training.
Okay, right. And then, but there's still really hard days and evolutions and things you got to pass and uncomfortable stuff. but it's not that cold, wet, staying up all night. That's the Hell Week stuff.
The Hell Week is the longest duration where you're going to be awake and cold. But again, they tell you this in training, you'll be far more cold, tired, hungry in the SEAL teams than you ever will be in that training environment. And it's true. Been far more cold on real life operations, far more tired, far more hungry, far more thirsty, far more just over it in real world situations than I ever was in training.
Wow, that's fascinating. Yeah, and I've heard that before as well. Any other thoughts on your service and SEALs that I might have missed there or anything before we move on?
I feel privileged that I was able to serve. Very few people are able to be issued a uniform with your country's flag on it. Most people are buying those shirts or those patches or the decals that go on their cars. And it's a really lucky place to be given that by your country. And I think it's important to realize that you're just renting it, that you don't own it. The people that own those things are the ones who come home in coffins underneath those flag. But that's what it was. It was privileged. I was privileged to be able to do that. It was unique. But for SEALs in general, I mean, and people looking at this who, maybe I'm the first SEAL that they've ever heard from. I doubt it, given the high profile nature of a lot of SEALs. My only advice to them is, take everybody as an individual, because the SEAL teams, the SEAL community, it is comprised of individuals, and not everybody is the same, and not everybody has the same take. And there's a lot of arguments and disagreements inside of the community. So take us as individuals and don't let any one person speak for the community.
Yeah, that's well said. Well, you're definitely unique, I would say, Andy, as a SEAL. You don't, if I met you on the street, I wouldn't think, wow, that guy's a SEAL.
That would be one of the last things that I would want you to know. I mean, on my resume, which I haven't had to use in a couple of years, it's like 6 or 7 bullet points down.
Got it. And that's by choice, because there's other things you want to tell people about you first.
Yeah, it's not a calling card. What am I going to do when I'm 50? That's still going to be the number one thing that is going to be my calling card, is something that I did decades ago. That's, for one, that's not fair to anybody who would be reading a resume, but it's also not fair to me. I don't want to define myself by my past achievements in that way. It was what I did. It's not who I am. And I think the worst thing that can happen to people from that community is they are unable or unwilling to detach themselves from that identity. It's a long-term recipe for disaster.
Can you speak a little more on that? In fact, if you do get attached to that identity, what goes wrong in that scenario?
You just can't move on. I know of guys, and I see guys who are in their 50s and they're still in the bar telling war stories. And then they're going to be 60 and they're still in the bar wanting people to respect them because they were a SEAL 3 decades ago. And then they're going to be, no, it doesn't, that picture doesn't get better with time. That's a red wine that ages very, very poorly. And I feel bad for those people because, again, it's an amazing and unique set of experiences, but it doesn't make you unique. Take that knowledge and that experience and try to make other people better with it. Try to figure out a way to bridge the gap between a unique military experience and be able to talk to somebody in the healthcare industry or a parent or any business sector and allow them to learn from your experiences so they don't have to repeat your mistakes. And then that's how we can incrementally continue to move society along.
It's a really powerful observation. I think the equivalent that I'm more familiar with is fighters. Like, I've known some fighters over the years, and when a fighter walks into a party or a bar, like, all the guys are like, oh my gosh, you're up here. And I've had fighters come to me and they're like, everyone always thinks I'm the coolest person in the world. And I'm not. I'm just a normal person with flaws. But because I'm a fighter, they put me up here. And I'm guessing that happens to veterans, and especially that's happened to SEALs. And that might be nice for a little while at the party, but after a while, it's going to get old, and it's probably also going to mess with your head. And then people think you're something you're not. And I guess I can see that could be a recipe for some problems.
Everybody needs to have the space and grace to be able to fail. And I'm sure you've heard this, be careful meeting your heroes, because eventually they're going to let you down. If people put you on a pedestal, it's a matter of time until you let them down and let yourself down. And it's a lot of pressure to put on somebody. I don't enjoy it at all. I am as flawed, if not more flawed than anybody else that I've ever met. And, people, again, they read a book, watch a TV show, see a movie, and they have this unrealistic expectation. At the end of the day, you're just talking about a human being. And if we're talking about human beings, we're inherently flawed. And you have to provide the space and grace for people to be that way.
I appreciate that a lot. Thanks, Andy. Talk to me about freedom. You made a post on July 4th, and you have a slightly different perspective of this because you spent a lot of your time fighting for freedoms, although I'm sure you don't want people all the time coming up and telling you that for maybe the reasons we just talked about. But you said this, and I thought it was interesting. You said, perhaps freedom and independence are more about the rights and opinions of others than your own. You said, perhaps true freedom is allowing those that boil your blood to voice their opinion without shouting them down. Perhaps if you think that our flag belongs more to you than it does to others, you are part of the problem. Then you finally said, perhaps regardless of how difficult it may be to see at times, we're so incredibly lucky and fortunate to call this country home. It will never be perfect, but that doesn't mean we should stop trying. Maybe you made that in reaction to some of the tumultuous events happening in the States and worldwide, but maybe talk about freedom and why you made that post and what you see as a veteran and also just as a human.
Well, I mean, I don't have a unique perspective just because I'm a veteran, and it's like it says in the post. I wore the flag on my uniform, and for many people in many of the countries that I was in, it was the first time they saw an American flag. So how I behaved is how they view America. But that doesn't mean the flag's mine, and that doesn't mean I own it any more than anybody else. Freedom, I often hear people talking about from a very myopic, self-centered perspective. I am free because I can say this. I can do that. And to me, it just makes more sense to flip that on its head. True freedom is not me being able to express my opinion. It's an environment where people, regardless if I agree with it or not, have the ability to speak in the way that they want to. And that doesn't mean that I have to agree with them. And you see it specifically right now in the US, this, I hate the term, but cancel culture. God forbid you say something that somebody else disagrees with. If they can gather a mob behind them, they'll try to shut you down. And that is the worst, economy of ideas that I've ever heard of. We should have an environment where ideas compete and the best ideas come to the surface and they win because they're the best idea, not because you have the most vocal mob behind you. And, I see people trying to define the flag based on their personal beliefs, or you see veterans who would get very passionate about the flag because they have had friends draped under that flag and who have been buried under that flag. And the reality is, who cares? And I'm not saying that in a negative manner. What I'm saying is that doesn't give you any more ownership of the flag than it does the person who decides that they want to burn it. You look at Colin Kaepernick and him taking a knee before the national anthem. People ask me about this one all the time. To me, what is a true expression of freedom? And it is that man deciding to take a knee before the national anthem. And it doesn't mean I have to agree with what he's saying. It doesn't mean that I have to agree with the tact that he is taking. It means that if we truly live in a free society, he can do what he wants. And he should be allowed to do what he wants without being shouted down. If you have a better idea, bring that idea to the table, and let's have an economy of ideas, and the best ideas will net themselves out. It's very frustrating to me because I see people unwilling or unable to get out of their own way again. They only view things from their perspective. And to me, that is so incredibly myopic. And that's how we go backwards as a country as opposed to forward.
And is it worse than you've ever seen it now? Is it worse than in modern history now?
I can say it's the worst that I've seen it in my life. I don't know about anything beyond that time period. I'm not a history buff by any stretch of imagination, and I can only talk about what I've seen through my own eyes.
Do you think it's also a factor that we live mainly in a digital world now where things are depersonified and it's just easy to cancel and fight behind a screen or fight without a face in front of you? Do you think that's part of the problem or not necessarily?
I think the interconnectedness and the fact that it exists 24 hours a day is a beautiful thing, but there's, it's a double-edged sword, because then you can't escape it either. We have access to unfettered information, but it seems like people are just trying to find the information that supports their personal bias or belief. And it's just once the snowball starts, it can't be stopped. So it's amazing that we can connect with people all over the world, but it's also unbearable when that snowball goes the wrong way. So I think there's an aspect of that for sure. It's just unfettered, unlimited access to information. Then you got to take into account the ratio of how much of that information is positive versus negative. I suspect most people, if they had to do a mathematical graph, it'd be about 80% negative, if not more, and very little positive. And I think that informs your mental state and your actions and the way that you treat other people.
Yeah, well, it's the if it bleeds, it leads type mentality where, you can point the fingers at the news organizations, but it's all of us that consume that as well. And so that just gets our attention. Maybe it's because of, we had to have that to even survive, maybe even genetically to notice the bad first. But yeah, all that stuff rises to the top. So you see a lot of negativity. I mean, they should call the news bad news. I know people that have worked in the newsroom and they said it's like Halloween every day. It's just what's the new horror show? And so we, like you said, we're consuming mostly negative stuff now, and it's 24/7.
Yeah. And, maybe we are genetically hardwired to see the bad first, but that used to be only the place where your eyeballs could geographically and physically see to the horizon, not the horizon of every single location of every single person on the face of the planet 24 hours a day.
I also think that the digitization dehumanizes the other person. I honestly think that if everybody was in a room or a community and talking to people and seeing the pain in their voice or seeing that they have kids just like you, that maybe you might, I don't know, I feel like we'd come to common ground sooner than when it's just kind of digitized and amplified. I don't know.
I have a elevator principle that I use for my interactions on social media. And it's pretty simple because I see people saying some pretty gnarly, out in the middle of nowhere stuff on social media because they know it's a consequence-free environment. So my personal standard that I hold myself to is I don't say anything to anybody on social media that I wouldn't say if we were trapped in an elevator together, because that changes the way that people interact and communicate.
Trapped for like an hour in an elevator.
Trapped for long enough where you'd have to say it to their face and deal with the consequences if they didn't like it.
Right. No, I think that's a good rule. What has been your reaction on the last couple months in the States? We've seen we've seen a lot of protests. We've seen a lot of anger. We've seen statues come down, calls for defunding the police, protests, George Floyd incident. What is your perspective on all this?
It's hard to unpack. I mean, you just in that one question right there is about 17 hours worth of discussion, but it's frustrating. It's heartbreaking to see people coming apart at the seams. I think that in addition to, I do believe in reform. I believe that policing should not be reformed now because of the George Floyd incident. I think it should constantly be observed and reformed as our society evolves. Just like I think politics should be, just like I think teaching should be. Fill in the blank. If you have a community or an organization, you should be open to reform. And that should be an ongoing conversation and process, not because something catastrophic happened. So obviously what happened with George Floyd was horrendous. But I also think that the cylinders were preloaded on that because people were compressed in their house. They were being told that they couldn't go anywhere. They were being socially isolated. So I understand the outburst and outpouring of anger. What I don't understand is burning a system to the ground without having an idea of what you want to replace it with. And I don't understand burning where you live to the ground either. Again, I understand the pent-up frustration and anger. The expression of it, I think, is going to end up doing more harm, not only to those individuals, but to the causes that they are supposedly supporting than good. I think they're actually going to end up shooting themselves in the foot. I think defunding the police is the polite way to say it. That's an idiotic idea. I do not think people are prepared to be their own first responder. I do not think that people are prepared to live in a world. And people will push back on this. They'll say, well, defunding the police doesn't actually mean defunding the police. It means rerouting some of their training and education budget. And the actual truth is, to some people, when they say defund the police, they mean exactly that. They're talking about abolishing the police. Some people are talking about rerouting the training. In my opinion, the police need more money for training because they have one of the most difficult jobs on the face of the planet. And I understand why people don't inherently feel and understand that, because they've never had to, day after day, hour after hour, minute after minute, show up to people's worst day of their life. People do not call 911 to report a birthday party that's going well. They call 911 to report a medical emergency, a family emergency, physical violence. And these same people report to people's worst day of their life time and time and time again. There's an amount of stress involved in that. I think the mental health, mental sanitation aspect of having them have a support network that can keep them in check, a checkup from the neck up type thing for those officers, all that costs money. They have an extremely difficult job. I think they need better training so that they can better serve society. And I don't know what it's going to end up being. There's two competing, ideologies, it seems right now. One is burn it completely to the ground and then let's start over. And the other one is like, hey, let's take a second here and really objectively assess what's going on and figure out a way to get where we want to be from where we are now. And I don't know which one is going to win out. I think right now it's a coin toss.
And you're a guy who's had millions and millions and millions of dollars of training. So you know what it takes to get you to a level to execute a difficult job. But you look at some of these police stops and the police actions, it doesn't look simple, any of that stuff. And when I start to hear about some of the training they get, it's almost shocking. I mean, sometimes it's like a few hours, like your first year or something, without any updates. And like you said, you're running on this kind of in this weird red zone most of the time anyways. And then people expect you to be able to disarm a civilian without causing harm, and yet you've never been taught that, whereas you probably were taught, various levels of all sorts of things. I mean, I guess you have a different perspective that way.
Well, it shouldn't be forgotten that I don't even know the statistics, but it would have to be the high 99.99999% of those challenging interactions go exactly the way that the civilian populace, that those police officers and first responders and law enforcement officers, that goes exactly the way that the civilian populace would want it to. If you were to put up and have a YouTube channel, one where things didn't go and rise to the standard that the civilian populace wanted versus the other channel that was full of the millions of police interactions every single day that don't end up leading the news because somebody accidentally lost their life, it would paint a drastically different picture of the policing culture inside of the United States. One of those channels would have some videos on there. And for me to be completely clear, the goal should be to have 0 videos on the channel that didn't go the way that it should have, or there's a deviation in policy. But the comparison in content and quality and volume of content between those two channels would be startling for people.
Yeah, no, well, to be continued, but it's hard to watch from over here. It just feels like there's a lot of pain and a lot of anger.
It's hard to watch from here.
Yeah.
It's not easy to watch anywhere.
Yeah, I can really imagine that. And what have been your thoughts? I mean, like you said, the cylinders were kind of loaded, with the whole pandemic and the lockdown. And what have your thoughts been on that? And where we're at now, where we're seeing kind of things open up and things closing back down. I know it's hurt the economy of Montana probably as it has everywhere else. What are your thoughts?
I mean, this rises to a one for me where I'm by no means qualified to answer. I don't know what to believe because I get bombarded by the same information as everybody else. Half of it says one thing, half of it says another. And there's people on both sides of that who say every piece of information coming from the other side is a conspiracy theorist or a lie or it's politically driven. And then the other side has their counterpoint. There are people saying exactly the same thing. So I really don't know. I don't know. I'm trying to be as safe as I can possibly be. I'm not traveling. I'm limiting my social contact. I don't want to get anybody sick, nor do I want to get anybody sick. But at the same time, I also don't want to enter into a global recession. I don't want people trapped in their homes that might be in an abusive family where kids or spouse are, they're now stuck with somebody that they were using their time at school as an escape from being abused or their time at work from being abused. But I don't know. I don't know what to make of it.
Yeah, or when it's going to stop, right? It's hard to tell at this point. It's morphing into a very interesting and tricky situation. It's going to take a lot of metal to push through that. Let me just shift gears and ask you a little bit about base jumping and the skydiving. Where did that come from? I mean, obviously you did some of that in SEALs, but then you decided to kind of take it to different levels. I know you went to some interesting levels of base jumping, and now you don't do that as much. But can you tell me about that whole adventure for you?
It started naturally, and it was a progression. So I was exposed to jumping while I was in the military. There's no base jumping in the military. There's no military application for that. So it was something that I was interested in but prohibited from doing while I was in the military. So when I got out of the military, I was skydiving a lot and got introduced to people who are base jumping. There's a lot of crossover between the communities, and if you're going to learn to base jump responsibly, I would recommend that you skydive first so you understand how a parachute works and steering it and landing it and all of those things. So I just continued to pursue the activities through people that I was very fortunate to get to know while in the military. They're, again, Unlimited budgets give you the opportunity to work with people at the highest level of their sport. So I knew a lot of professional skydivers. I continued to train with them, and it naturally and slowly just progressed from one to the other. So it more than anything, getting out of the military, it kind of let the governor off of my restrictions when it came to my desire to do them. Now those restrictions were gone.
Okay. And tell me about base jumping. Like, first of all, what is that for people that don't know? And what does it require from you to be able to do something? And do you remember your first one?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely remember my first one. It can be overly romanticized when it comes to the risk involved. It is a risky activity, but you can mitigate and manage that risk to a very high degree. Base jumping, essentially, the acronym BASE stands for building, antenna, span, and earth. It's the 4 types of objects that you can jump off of, and that's exactly what it is. It is jumping off of a fixed or static object as opposed to jumping out of an aircraft. If you think of those objects, a building, an antenna, a span, or earth, altitude is an issue, so you're jumping at a lower altitude, so you have 1 parachute instead of 2 because you're closer to the ground. And because you're closer to the ground, you know, it's visibly different. It feels different because you have less airspeed, so you have less control over your body. And it's scary. I mean, you're facing your mortality at a closer proximity than you are skydiving. Skydiving seems a little bit more abstract because you're 13, 14, 15,000 feet up. It looks like a pastel painting. Whereas when you're base jumping from 400 feet off the ground, if you spit to check the wind and you watch it drift until it hits the ground, you can imagine your body impacting there if things don't go the right way.
Yeah, I've done 2 skydives. They were tandem, but I agree. It felt like that pastel painting. And even though I was terrified, which I guess that goes away after 10 or 100 jumps, still there was a disconnect from the ground. So I know what you mean by that. Yep. I guess that doesn't exist with base. It's also...
You're very, very proximal to the object you may impact when you base jump.
Right, but you were searching that out. You really wanted to do that.
I did. It was something that seemed interesting to me, but like I said, it was prohibited inside of the military. So I waited until those governors were gone, and then I happened to know the right people who introduced me to others that were at the leading edge of that sport, and those are the people that I pursue when I want to learn something new. I go try to find people who are an expert in their field, and then I do exactly what they tell me to do.
And how did that evolve into the wingsuit?
Again, through skydiving. So I started wingsuiting while I was skydiving, which is highly recommended. And then I started base jumping without a wingsuit, and then eventually combined the two once I had the requisite skill and knowledge on both.
Okay. You said real quickly, highly recommended. Why'd you say that?
Well, both have consequences. Wingsuits, you know, that fabric suit, you either need to fly the suit or the suit is going to fly you. And you need to experience that and train those thresholds in a skydiving environment where you have altitude, you have time, you have a reserve parachute in case you have to deploy your main parachute in an uncontrolled situation and therefore jettison it. The time to do that is not in a base jump where you need to execute everything perfectly or it might take your life.
Okay, got it. So at altitude, you train with the wingsuit so you understand its limitations and potentially its control even over you. And then hopefully you master it where you can do that at low altitude.
Correct.
And that's where you see those crazy videos.
Yeah. And again, there's a systematic approach to all that. It's not this ad hoc, laissez-faire attitude of, hey, let's go send it off this cliff and hope for the best. I mean, the training and all the stuff that leads up to it, that just usually doesn't show up on the YouTube videos.
Right. And there's a long line of people that were, that had suits, wingsuits that aren't here, right? It's a very dangerous pursuit.
It is a very dangerous pursuit, but there's also ways that you can do it very safely. You know, the number of people who are trying to fly 2 to 3 feet off the ground or in between the trees that are dead is a substantially higher number than those who are still base jumping, but they don't choose to fly at that proximity to the ground. I mean, there's mitigating and controlling factors that you can choose to implement or not.
When you see those videos of guys flying like through holes in rocks or around trees, like what's your reaction to something like that?
I have an appreciation for it because I've taken it to that level myself and realized what it takes, the currency and competency of being able to do that. So I understand the level that they're operating at. I have an appreciation of how close they are to their threshold. And I also have, again, no more desire to do that because of exactly those things. I know what it takes and I know where you are in relationship to your threshold.
Was there an incident you had where you were like, okay, I'm done. I'm going to pull back. And also, I mean, you've also lost friends in this space as well. Was it a combination of those two that caused you to kind of stop doing this?
I can't say I've really had a close call that shook me up to the point where I really reconsidered it. It was more the loss of friends over time. And again, realizing maybe we're at a crap table, and how many times do we want to throw these dice? Because if I choose not to participate to the level that I was, I'm reducing the number of rolls of the dice.
And with bass, am I right in thinking that a lot of times you'll actually climb up to these peaks and then you'll make the decision to go? Is that a pretty standard practice?
It depends on where you are. Like Switzerland is a good example. There's trains and trolleys and trams. Sometimes you're hiking downhill, but other than that, in the U.S., it's a foot-powered ascent, and then you get there and you got to assess the wind, the visibility, and all the other environmental metrics that go into it.
And how do you know whether it's time to dive or time to walk away? And what are those factors? Are they environmental or can they be mental with you? And what are some of the lessons maybe you learned about yourself and about life by having to make that choice?
It's a combination of both. I mean, clouds are a good example. If it's socked in with fog, it's probably not a good idea to jump when you can't see where you're going to be going. Too much wind, if you are standing on the edge of a cliff and the wind is in your face, your suit will have an increased level of performance, just like an airplane. If the wind is at your back, it'll have a decreased level of performance. So that's a go, no go criteria right there. And then from a mental perspective, if you're so scared that you can't mentally think through the process that you're about to execute, perhaps don't do it. And also, if you're up there and you're not scared, that to me would be an even greater warning sign. So it's a balance of those things. It's hard to describe. I don't have a checklist that I physically break out with me and I take a look at, but it's a combination of mental, physical, and environmental.
Did you learn any of these mental lessons from fellow base jumpers?
More through conversations. There's no real way, you're talking about the mentor I had in that sport. We would talk a lot about how we felt at the exit. We would talk a lot about our plans. We would put a lot of things into a system or a procedure-based approach, as opposed to, hey man, we're fired up. Let's go do this. I'm like, yeah, we are fired up and go do this, but now let's break this down into phases. What's our primary plan, secondary plan, tertiary plan? So I learned all of those things through my mentor, in specifically base jumping.
Okay. And that's it. You don't base jump anymore.
I'm in a place where, given the travel restrictions, I could base jump where I am in Montana. I'm not in a point in my life right now where I can dedicate the time to currency and competency. So it's safer for me just to put it on the back burner.
Okay. So now it's skydiving only.
Yes, but also Montana is not great for drop zones. So right now the jumping has drastically decreased since we have lived here, but that's okay because my jiu-jitsu has rapidly increased. And, I'm sitting in the podcast studio, so I'm working on, developing those other things. So it's, as some things ebbs, others flow.
I used to fly R-22 helicopters. I was getting my license here. And I had I'd started in Chicago and I was in London getting the rest of it. I had like maybe 50, 60 hours or something. I did a couple solo flights. And my first jiu-jitsu lesson, I stopped flying. I just stopped flying. It was so weird, Andy, and I didn't realize it for months. And then I was like, oh, I stopped flying helicopters. And I think it replaced maybe what we were talking about in the beginning, I think it replaced that mental space because I think when I'm flying that R-22, especially on a solo, I mean, Jesus, you're definitely not thinking about the mortgage because I'm pretty terrified when I'm on that damn lawnmower. But jiu-jitsu seemed to kind of replace that for me. And that's kind of how I move forward.
Diversity of experiences. I really recommend people go out and they mess with a bunch of stuff and find what works for them. And that's, again, why I hate broad prescriptions, because the broader it is, the more inaccurate I find it to be.
Yeah, no, I'm glad you said that. You've had some parachutes fail on you skydiving. You also, I think, once said that most people who die skydiving die with perfectly functional equipment. What's the lesson to learn there?
Stay inside of the tolerances of your physical ability. There was a period of time in civilian skydiving where they have these parachutes that are semi-elliptical. They're made of zero porosity material. They are incredibly maneuverable and fast. But if you enter into a very steep or dynamic turn beyond, it takes a certain amount of altitude for it actually to plane out. And people were dying because they were entering into turns far too low, because they were pushing their personal limits beyond, they were making a bad decision, essentially. And I don't know if that was because of a lack of currency or they were trying to do something more impressive or whatever it may be, but they had a perfectly functioning piece of equipment above their head and they made a poor decision and it cost them their life. So it's, you hear people say like, oh, you don't know where your boundaries are until you push them. Well, push them responsibly. So the first time that you push them, you don't go so far past it that it's irrecoverable.
And what's it like when your parachute fails when you're skydiving?
Far less dramatic than you might think. I mean, the first time it happens, you're a little bit nervous because you wonder whether or not the reserve parachute is going to open. And then I think I've had 6 or 7 cutaways of my main parachute, which might sound like a lot, but it's not after jumping for 20 years and 7,500 jumps. And at this point, it's pretty rote. You look up, that parachute doesn't look correct or it's not working, execute your emergency procedures and move on with your day.
Okay, got it. Anything else about base jumping or skydiving that we should know?
Approach it with caution. It's an incredibly rewarding activity, but the consequences can be incredibly steep, especially if you lose sight of where your boundaries are.
I remember like I said, I had 2 jumps and and they were both tandems. And I remember there was a guy skydiving with us who was going to go upside down or something on his way down. And he had done thousands of jumps. And I remember he said, I wish I was you. He said, I wish I could get the same adrenaline rush I used to get. He said, I don't get anywhere near it anymore. Yep. And it was a weird statement, and I think it caused him maybe to take some extra risks to get that same feeling. And it was interesting to see how maybe you could come accustomed to that maybe you would make a mistake.
It becomes very routine. They develop an occupation and something that used to become a hobby or an escape for them. And I've actually now met some black belts, who they have time where they burn out, and they look at the joy that a white belt in their first month of training and the learning curve that individual is on, right? Because the learning curve for a black belt has got to be so infinitesimally small because there are, they're doing fractions of a percentage where let's say in your first 2 years, your growth is insane and you're passionate about it. And Like it's the same thing. I think if your passion becomes your hobby or other way around, I'm sorry, if your hobby and passion becomes your occupation, I think oftentimes there's a risk of burnout or things just becoming far too routine.
Yeah, I used to train young kids in the city of London in finance, and they would come in thinking, "Oh man, like so much," and I'm like, "But you're enthusiastic, and almost by definition, I can't have that. So you've got that advantage. Don't ever sell that out, and that can take you a."
Don't worry, they'll lose it.
They will right over time. Oh my gosh. Can we talk about CrossFit? Because you had some statements recently, and we've seen a lot of change happening in that industry. I guess the CEO, Greg Glassman, resigned, and you made a statement about it. Tell us, what are your thoughts on CrossFit and Greg and everything?
I think the methodology is amazing. I love it's just beautifully elegant in its simplicity. I love the efficiency of it. I love the efficacy of it. I think the CrossFit community, and by that I mean the affiliate gyms, will be fine with or without CrossFit headquarters, which is another word of describing CrossFit Inc., which is the parent company that is 100% owned by Greg. He's announced that he's going to sell the company. What he did not announce is what percentage of his shares he was actually going to sell. So there are, I think, some answers that are still deserved by the affiliate community. But again, people can feel free to ignore me, to include Greg. I worked for the company for 8 years, 4 indirectly for him, 4 directly for him. I left because I could not tolerate working for him as a human being, as an individual anymore. And I told him that when I left. We had a couple hours of what I could describe as an exit interview. And I told him exactly what I thought of him and his leadership style and why I was leaving, because he asked me. He owes a lot of people some explanations, in my opinion. And right now, what I see him doing is an attempt to tuck and run for the first time. And I hope he's not allowed to do so, because he had a lot of negative impact as an individual on a lot of people's lives. And I think he should stand in judgment of those things. But that's beyond me to make those determinations. But I hope that he has to see that judgment at some point.
And he's kind of accused of kind of having this corporate ethos of treating women badly, or is it just that, or also just being abusive or not respectful? Was it all those things? And did you see those things as well? And does he need to confront and apologize for those things?
It was all of those things, and that's as deep as I will go into it now because I think that there are still some more things that are going to come out in the future. An apology would be a great start from him, but is that going to do enough? No. He did substantial and long-lasting damage to people, and I think that those people should deserve to see justice regardless of any statute of limitations.
Okay. But the fact that he's gone as CEO is a good sign, but you're saying what's the ownership is the real question, and then what are the reparations? That's what you want to know, and that's what you want to see.
I would say him leaving as the CEO is a good start, but leadership drives culture. And anybody who thinks that one person leaving and the entire culture of an organization changing, they're living in a fairy tale. So that organization needs to be looked at very broadly with a microscope, and there's some more changes that need to be made.
Yeah, that's well said, Andy. I mean, we saw this at Uber when they got rid of the CEO, but you can't get rid of the CEO and expect a corporate culture to change. I mean, you know.
Especially if it's entrenched, and especially if you leave people in that organization that were very proximal or described as their inner circle. You know, especially if those people were empowered or put into positions that are hard to challenge, it's going to take more than just one person leaving. Again, but that's CrossFit Inc. The CrossFit community, the affiliates, they'll be fine either way.
They will be. So the affiliates, that culture doesn't trickle down to the affiliates?
They're very detached. And affiliate owners can best answer this for themselves, but I would suspect very few of them, if any, actually have any direct relationship with CrossFit headquarters at a deep level. So they're already off operating and executing their own best business principles and models anyway.
Did any of those bad practices, though, carry down anyways somehow to those affiliates? Or was it?
I would doubt it.
Doubt it. Okay. And do you think that if you abolish the CrossFit Inc., that it might hurt by not having the unity, the standards? Because, I mean, obviously, like you said, CrossFit had some amazing things about it. But would you lose that without a strong headquarter or Inc.?
I don't think so. Because, again, I think if you talk to most affiliates, what they're going to tell you is they don't have much tie to CrossFit Inc. It's an affiliation model, not a franchise model. They don't provide best business practices. They don't provide territory protection. And affiliates are out there, executing their business to their best practices for the geography that they are in. Yeah, I mean, that'd be for them to answer. My personal assessment would be I don't think it would affect their business either way.
Okay. Do you still train CrossFit?
I do.
Okay. I need to find one of these in London and get into it. I've known a lot of people that have and heard some great things as well and seen a lot of it. What about you? What's next for your next 5 years? And what do you spend a lot of your time doing? I know you've got your podcast studio there, and you do some speaking when you can travel. But what's your future look like?
I think a combination of those two things. I've been surprised by how much I've enjoyed doing the podcast. I'm fascinated by other people. I really don't care very much about myself or think that anything that I have done is fascinating. But the podcast is an interesting tool to meet new people and to talk about their experiences from which I can learn from, how they were able to achieve the things that they were able to achieve. The public speaking thing, as the podcast grows, so do the inquiries when it comes to public speaking. So there's somewhat of a tie there. Whether or not, I don't know what the post-COVID-19 era is going to look like. I don't know, as businesses start going more remote, I don't know if it's going to ever be a place where I can go speak at a Barclays across the pond or fill in the blank. So we'll see. But I enjoyed doing that. The monetary aspect is nice from it, but I really just I've determined that I enjoy teaching. So I'm going to try to continue to interface in those areas because I also believe that podcasting, you sit down and have a great conversation with somebody who's a high achiever, and regardless the category that they're in, that's a learning experience, not only for me, but anybody who chooses to tune in. So continue to just kind of do the things that I'm already doing now and hopefully just try to take them to the next level.
Yeah, I love podcasting. I mean, I've got the best seat in the house because I get to learn from the greatest in the world. It's like I've gotten a PhD, like a triple PhD over the last 9 years. And then
it's amazing.
Yeah, it's a game changer. I teach podcasting in my academy, and I've got about 130 students going through my 8-week course now, and they think I'm crazy, but I tell them this is the fountain of youth. This will make you more human than any other human experience because you got to show up, you got to confront your own viewpoints, you have to be bombarded by ideas that you might not want to hear, depending on who you have on your show. It'll force you to evolve in a way you never thought. for me, it's been a massive game changer. Massive. I wouldn't have kids if it wasn't for this show. Straight up.
Yeah.
I wouldn't be sober if it wasn't for this show. Straight up. And it goes on and on and on. So I could see you got the bug, and
For sure.
I can see why. You have what kind of conversations do you want to have? Like, I would ask you for dream guests, but I kind of hate it when people ask me that. But like, what kind of conversations do you want to have?
Yeah, to me, it's less about the guest and more about their ability to impart their experiences and talk about them. Deep and meaningful would be the best answer that I could give you. I don't care about the genre necessarily. I'm open to having people on who have completely different opinions that I do, people that I don't agree with, people that I do agree with, men, women, I could care less, athletes. It doesn't matter. I just want to have meaningful conversations, and I love not being boundaried by time.
Yeah, it's crucial. It's the new way of learning, for sure. What does cleared hot mean?
Cleared hot is the final radio call overseas before you're allowed to have aircraft release ordnance. So as the controller on the ground, you will tell the aircraft pilot they are cleared hot, which means you accept responsibility for the result of the ordnance impacting on the ground.
Okay. And why call it that? Because you weren't a pilot.
I wasn't, but again, the cleared hot call comes from the guy on the ground, and I was a JTAC, so I've made that call many times. And again, I guess it's a passive statement of accepting responsibility for the things that come out of my mouth.
Okay, that's nice. I like that. And you've got a studio there, but you're doing remote episodes as well?
Yeah, sometimes.
Okay. Yeah, for 9 years we didn't do anything remote, but obviously we're changing with the times.
Yeah. Don't have a choice.
Yeah, we seriously don't have a choice. And I always ask a few questions at the end. I'm going to ask you if you could pick up the phone and call up 20-year-old Andy and give that young man some advice based on everything you know now, SEAL career, being a father, all the experience you had jumping, what would you tell him?
The following success secrets are only available inside the London Real Tribe, where you get exclusive access and insights from our high-performance guests on wealth creation, productivity, leadership, morning routines, health, and well-being. To join our tribe community, go to londonreal.tv/tribe. Now, let's continue with the show.
Andy, I appreciate you. If people want to subscribe to Cleared Hot and find out more about you, is there a website or what's the best way?
Like you said, the podcast itself, Cleared Hot, so that's an easy one to find on iTunes or wherever you get your podcast stuff. For myself, if you're curious about who I am, it's just my name, andystumpf.com. And then social media, that's all versions of my name.
Right. Okay, good stuff. Andy, I really appreciate the time. And again, like when I've watched a lot of material on you, and I just appreciate the fact that you're super honest and candid about who you are. And again, I felt that very differently always watching your stuff, and it was kind of refreshing because sometimes I feel kind of excluded to certain people and their stories, and I feel like I shouldn't, and I just like how frank you are about it, and I just appreciate that. And I do think it's a smart way to live your life as well, because like you said, you don't want to be the person that has their identity in something else. I mean, for me, the longest time, my identity was, as a banker and as a guy, this or that. And when I had to switch to broadcasting, it was all gone, and I had to confront that. And I'm always trying to see if I can just get rid of that to try to move forward. And I think you do a great job of that. So thank you for that perspective. I appreciate everything you do.
Yeah, you're very welcome. Figuring it out as I go. I don't have a master plan. I'm just trying to stay true to who I am.
Right, aren't we all? Next time, let's do this either in London or Montana. And maybe I'll come out there, go skiing again. And until then, wishing you all the best. Thanks so much for the time.
Appreciate it, Brian.
All right, great stuff. Follow this man, Andy Stumpf, and his podcast, Cleared Hot. And thank you all for the time. We will see you next time on London Real. Take care.